This is Nick VanAcker, Science on a Sphere Coordinator at the MSU Museum. I'm excited to bring you guys another Science on a Sphere virtual show. So as it gets warmer and we're getting closer to summer, you've probably noticed that a lot of plants are starting to bloom. And you might have noticed that around those flowers, there are usually some insects buzzing around. And those insects are going to be the topic of today's SOS show. We're going to be talking about pollinators. So we're going to highlight some different types of pollinators that are great to have in your yard and garden. We're going to highlight some of the challenges that pollinators are facing right now. And we'll also look at how you can help pollinators in your own backyard. So what is a pollinator and why do they matter? To answer that question, we have to think about plants. So there are lots of different types of plants, but the plant type we're talking about today are called flowering plants because, get this, they have flowers on them. We can use something that we're probably all familiar with as an example of flowering plants. So we're going to be looking at a tomato. So we can start really anywhere in this cycle, but we can start off just with the one that we're probably most familiar with, which is going to be the fruit of the tomato. That's a big red juicy part that you cut up and put on a sandwich. But the fruit of a tomato has seeds inside. So eventually the seed might come out of the tomato. It would grow into a young plant. The young plant grows into a mature plant, which eventually has flowers on it. Well, those flowers eventually turn into the fruit of the tomato, which has seeds in it. The cycle goes on and on and on. But this cycle doesn't occur just by itself. In order for this blossom to become a fruit, we need pollinators. So when we're looking at that cycle, if we were to start off with the flower, there's actually kind of a mini cycle that happens inside that flower. And that cycle begins with pollen. So you might have heard of pollen before. You're probably very familiar with it if you have a pollen allergy, if you get the sniffles around this time of year. But pollen is a fine powder that's used to make seeds. There's a couple of different parts to this flower that we're going to talk about, but the main things that you need to remember are the stamen, or the stamen, which is where the pollen is made, and the pistil, which is the kind of reproductive part of the flower where pollen ends up. So this whole process basically just needs pollen, those little fine grains, to get from the stamen where it's made over to the pistil where it can go into a seed. This can happen sometimes through the wind. It could happen just by the little bits of the stamen kind of bumping up against the pistil. But usually what needs to happen is some sort of an insect needs to come along, needs to pick up some pollen from the stamen, and then fly along to another flower and drop off that pollen at the pistil of another flower. And that's a pollinator. That's what pollinators do. So usually there's some sort of kind of sweet treat that the pollinator will get at each flower. Usually it's something like nectar. It's kind of a sweet, sticky liquid that the pollinator likes. So that's the reason that they go from flower to flower. But pollinators help bring this pollen around. They bring it from flower to flower. And without pollinators, flowers wouldn't get pollinated, and we would have a lot fewer flowers next year. So when most people think about pollinators, they probably think about honeybees. And honeybees are important. They're responsible for pollinating about $15 billion of the United States agricultural crops, and most of the fruits and veggies that you buy in a store were probably pollinated by honeybees. But honeybees are actually a really small part of the pollinator community, and they aren't actually native to Michigan. They're native to Europe. So usually honeybees act more like livestock, kind of like cows or chickens or pigs. They're used to help pollinate a lot of the agricultural crops of the United States. But unless you keep honeybees, usually the insects pollinating your garden aren't going to be honeybees. They're going to be native pollinators. When I say that, I mean pollinators that are native to the area that you live in. So what sorts of insects are native pollinators? Well, one type is bees. So even though honeybees aren't native to Michigan, there are a lot of types of bees that are native to Michigan. There's actually 450 different wild bee species in Michigan. This could be all sorts of different things. There's some that you might be familiar with, like bumblebees. You've probably seen those around. But there's also a lot of them that are really diverse and crazy. And these pictures are just a few of the different types of bees. Like I said, there's 450 different species. But things like cuckoo bees and masked bees and cellophane bees. Bees that you might not even know exist are helping to pollinate the plants in your yard and garden every day. And there's a more complete list in where I got this image at pollinators.msu.edu. So bees are one type of pollinator, but of course another common type of pollinator that you're probably familiar with are butterflies and moths. So there's hundreds of different species of butterflies and moths in Michigan, and they act the same way as bees, moving from flower to flower, drinking nectar, collecting pollen, pollinating flowers on the way. But bees and butterflies don't just pollinate your garden. The world's actually a lot larger than that. And to prove that, we're going to look at a data set. So this data set is one from iNaturalist, which is an app that's used by citizen scientists. So it could be literally anybody with a camera who wants to make observations about the scientific world. But each of these orange dots that you see represents one sighting of a monarch butterfly over the course of a year. And these butterflies were spotted, like I said, by citizen scientists and then uploaded to iNaturalist. We downloaded that data to create this data set. So we're going to look just at North America here, and you can see the huge migration that monarch butterflies take. They don't just hang out in your backyard. They're actually moving a lot further than that. So we'll start off the journey of our monarch butterflies in the northern part of North America. We'll wait for it to kind of cycle through to there. But so say the journey started in the northern part of America. As the days start to grow colder and we get closer to fall, the monarchs start a huge migration. They start flying slowly south all the way across the United States and parts of Canada, depending on where they started, to get all the way down to their destination, which is the forest of a few mountains in Mexico. And once they get there, it's like a giant butterfly party. There's so many monarchs in just these few concentrated spots in these forests in Mexico and also on the coast of California. It's just this massive population of monarch butterflies. These butterflies will stay here over the winter until around March usually, but their migration is just beginning. So those butterflies have flown from all the way in the northern part of the United States, maybe parts of Canada, all the way down to Mexico. And once spring comes, these monarchs are done resting for the winter. They're going to lay eggs and unfortunately die. Once they lay their eggs, though, those eggs are going to hatch into a new generation, which is going to continue the rest of the migration. And that generation is going to start flying north. So we'll go back to our data set and we can check that out. So once the monarchs in Mexico lay their eggs, that new generation hatches and starts to fly north. They start going to locations that they've never seen before. This is a new generation of baby butterflies. So they'll fly north just a little bit. They may make it to someplace like Mexico, maybe Oklahoma, depending on how far they're able to travel. But they won't complete the migration either. That generation of butterflies is going to fly north just a little bit. They're going to stop, breed, lay eggs, pollinate a bunch of flowers, and then they're going to die as well. Those eggs are going to hatch into a new generation of butterflies, which is going to fly a little bit further north. They might make it just up to Tennessee, maybe up to Ohio area. Then they're going to reproduce. They're going to lay eggs. They're going to pollinate a bunch of flowers. They're going to die. That next generation is going to make it the rest of the way there. So this whole migration process can sometimes take 3 or 4 generations for monarchs to get from Mexico all the way back to the place that the original generation started, in a place like Michigan, for instance. And around that time, it's usually around the end of the summer, so that generation will pollinate some flowers, collect some nectar, lay some eggs, and then die as well, just in time for their children to become what's called the super generation. That generation of butterflies that makes the journey all the way from the north in Canada and Michigan, all the way down south to Mexico. And of course, pollinating plants across the United States the whole way there and back. And so across their journey, these butterflies are going to come across a lot of dangers. There might be predators, there might be cold nights, but there are 2 dangers that are a really big problem, not only for monarchs, but for all pollinators. And those are lack of habitat and pesticides. So lack of habitat means that pollinators aren't able to find enough food to support themselves. And pesticides are something you're probably familiar with. They're chemicals that are used when we're farming or when we're trying to basically just keep pests in air quotes, away from our agricultural crops, try and keep things nice and bug-free. Pesticides have a lot of problems, but the main problem is that they don't just target the bad insects that are attacking our crops. They can target almost any type of insect. So when you combine the fact that there's a group of insects that doesn't have enough to eat, they don't have enough plants, flowering plants to get nectar from, along with the fact that they're being slowly poisoned, you end up with a lot of dead pollinators. And this can result in something that you might have heard of when it refers to honeybees. That's called colony collapse disorder. which basically just means that big colonies of honeybees were collapsing and nobody really knew why. And now we know that it was a combination of a lot of things like disease, but also lack of habitat and also being exposed to a lot of different pesticides. So we're going to look at the United States again for this one. But this data set shows the use of pesticides across the world from 1991 to 2017. So the darker green a country is, the more pesticides were used there that year. And this is something really important to think about because pollinators don't care about borders. So obviously, one of the best things that you can do to protect pollinators from a lack of habitat and from pesticides is to create good habitat for pollinators in your yard and to not use pesticides in your yard. That's a really great way. It's two easy things to do. You don't spray chemicals in your yard. You don't spray these bad bug-killing chemicals in your yard, and you provide them with food. It's pretty good habitat for pollinators. But the problem is, just because you aren't using pesticides, that doesn't mean that your neighbor is doing the same thing. Your neighbor might be spraying pesticides all over their garden, trying to get some great bug-free tomatoes, not realizing that they're actually killing the bugs that can also help pollinate their tomatoes. And of course, the other issue too is that some of the exposure that insects have to pesticides doesn't all come from directly being sprayed with pesticides. A lot of times you'll spray a plant down with pesticides. There might be an insect on there that would be directly sprayed and then would die. But usually what happens is you spray a pesticide on a plant and then an insect comes along maybe a few hours later, lands on the plant and still gets exposed to those pesticides. Maybe you spray the pesticides on the plant and then it rains and all those pesticides run off into the soil, run off into an area that wasn't meant to be sprayed, along a crop row or along the edge of a field where you have a lot of native bees nesting, and then those bees get affected by the pesticides. There's all sorts of different ways that pesticides are able to get to insects that they aren't intended for, and unfortunately, they still end up affecting those insects. The idea of this goes for countries as well. We're looking at a global map. So even if the United States is doing a good job with pesticides, maybe Canada or Mexico aren't. Or vice versa, if Canada and Mexico are doing a really good job with pesticides and not using them as often, maybe the United States isn't. So when we're thinking about how to protect pollinators, it's great to think locally. It's great to not use pesticides in your own yard, of course, but it's also really important to think nationally and to think globally because bugs don't care about borders. They follow these huge migration routes, like I said, with the monarchs, or even just with bees in your area aren't going to just stay in your yard. They're going to be flying all over the place. So it's important to think about how pesticides are being used all over the area. So what can you actually do to help pollinators? Well, one great thing to do is to plant native plants. This is an image, again, I got from pollinators.msu.edu, which is a great resource I highly recommend you check out. It's part of MSU's extension. It's taken by Sarah B. Scott. But so a lot of the plants that you should plant if you're trying to protect native pollinators are native plants. And native plants are exactly what they sound like. They're plants that grow wild in your area. Now you might have heard it's really great to plant wildflowers for pollinators, and that's true, but not all native plants are wildflowers. There's lots of things like native shrubs and native grasses and things that are still really beneficial for these native pollinators. And native plants are great. As you can see in the image, a lot of native plants are really, really beautiful, but they also come with a lot of benefits. Sure, they help pollinators, but they're also native to the area. So if we're talking about native Michigan plants, these plants have evolved in Michigan. So they're used to the amount of rain that we get, which means they don't need a lot of extra watering. They can sustain any droughts that we have. They're used to the amount of sunlight that we get. So it doesn't matter as much if you plant them in sun or in shade. I mean, obviously a plant's going to do well in certain types of areas, but it doesn't matter as much because they're used to the environment that we have here in Michigan. They're also used to temperatures. So a lot of times if you're planting vegetables or if you're planting, really pretty exotic flowers, you might only be able to put them out certain times of the year. You have to wait till the last frost happens. But native plants are used to the weather that we have in Michigan. So they're really a lot less maintenance than some other plants. And they look really, really beautiful and they help pollinators. So it's really a win for everyone. Another great thing that you can do, which is a really fun activity to help pollinators, is to create a bee hotel. So this hotel is a really great place to help some of our 450 native bee species, which lay their eggs over the winter and hatch a new generation of helpful pollinators in the spring. And this is an example of a bee hotel that I actually made myself, which shows you how easy it is to do. Um, it's a really fun activity. It's a great activity you can do by yourself or with your family, and it's pretty simple. When you're making your own bee hotel, it's not that hard to do. You basically just make a big box and fill it up full of tubes. And luckily, there's a really great resource, again, on pollinators.msu.edu that is really helpful in planning your bee hotel. Planning is the most important because you want to make sure that your hotel is actually going to be useful for the insects that you want to use it. Different types of bees like different types of hotels, like different types of tubes, different sizes, different materials. So you're going to want to figure out what type of bees you would like to help and then focus on that species. It's better to have a really, really great habitat for a couple of species than it is to have just an okay habitat trying to attract a lot of different things, because you might not get anything if that's the case. You might have seen these hotels already. They're pretty popular right now in a lot of stores and garden centers. And those hotels are great. They're a great base. But some of the materials that they have inside them aren't actually that helpful for insects. It just kind of helps them look cute. So if you want to, if you're not handy with your woodworking skills, you can always buy one of those and then empty out some of the materials and replace them with materials that will actually be helpful for insects. But like I said, it's pretty simple. Once you make your plan, all you really need is just a few materials. You'll need some wood, some screws or nails, and then you'll need some of the materials to put inside. I ended up using bamboo rods, but really any tube-shaped craft material that's natural should work pretty well. If you don't want to buy those, I had them left over from a project, but you could also use the leftover stems from some thicker flowers if you have those lying around your yard from last year. You still haven't cleaned out your beds yet. So there's a lot of really great opportunities. You can also just use, like I did, some wooden blocks that have some holes drilled in them. I also have a few other goodies in there as well. But it's really simple to create. So I hope that you take me up on that. But in the meantime, thank you so much for tuning into the Pollinator program. As always, we'd like to thank MSU FCU, who sponsored the Science on a Sphere exhibit, and all of our great community sponsored who offered private donations to help make this exhibit happen. If you'd like to help support the museum and our education programming, you can do so by donating to the link in the comments. I hope you learned a little bit about pollinators today, maybe some things that you didn't know before. I hope that you make a bee hotel or plant a pollinator garden. And thank you so much, and I hope that you guys have a wonderful day.